Hey everyone, and welcome to the How to Teach Anything podcast, the show where we interview different instructors, coaches, and educators to see what we can learn about the art of teaching. My name is Matt Eiler, and I'll be your host as we discuss best practices to teach anything. Let's get started. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the How to Teach Anything podcast. Our guest today is Joanna Rawbone. She runs Flourishing Introverts, a coaching and training consultancy, which looks to enable introverts to own and play to their strengths authentically. She has a master's of science in change agent skills and strategies, and she even gave her own TEDx talk on untapped potential of introverts back in 2019. Joanna, how are you doing today? It's so nice to meet you.
I'm really good, thank you.
Excellent. Awesome. We're so happy to have you. So your organization talks a lot about empowering introverts. That's a word that I think gets thrown around a lot, lately. Could you explain to us so we have a solid definition of what exactly is an introvert and how are they different from the opposite, maybe extroverts?
Yeah, thanks. And you're right, it is a kind of continuum. And even within that, there is a lot that's misunderstood. So I go back to the original Jungian definition. I'm a Jungian at heart rather than a Freudian. And what Jung talked about is the difference between introverts and extroverts is where we get our energy from and what drains our mental batteries. So introverts, and intro means obviously turn inwards, means that we get our energy from within, which is why introverts will often take themselves away quietly to recharge their batteries, which is exactly the opposite to extravert. And originally Jung talked about extra meaning outwards, not extro. And extraverts get their energy from social interactions, from busy environments, from change, from active experiences. So the very thing that charges the battery of an extrovert drains the battery of an introvert. And that's why there's often tension between the two, because extroverts don't quite understand why introverts are quiet, and introverts are just going, stop talking. So there's often a challenge there.
Yeah. Well, we know as, coaches, instructors, and, teachers in traditional classrooms, we have students of all different types, right? We're going to encounter both of those. What are some ways that you've seen a person that is introverted maybe struggling in your traditional classroom or in settings where extroverts are maybe more of what's considered the norm or the more successful student?
Yeah, and you're right to name that, because the extroversion bias starts in social and family life, moves into education, and then into the workplace. And for most introverts, we have a different communication process to extroverts. So our communication process tends to be think, say, think. So when you ask us a question, we genuinely check in with ourselves, figure out what our response is, and then want to give you our considered well-formed response. Extroverts, on the other hand, have a say, think, say communication process. So they can give you an immediate answer. It may not be the answer that they mean, but it's, and that means they're probably not so attached to their answers, but they're likely to give you something really fast. And in our world today that values those fast responders, as opposed to the considered response, we often find that introverts don't get into the conversation. Let me share a story with you. So yeah. I've been a trainer, coach, facilitator since 1987. And back in about 96, 97, I was a delegate on a training course. By now, I already knew I was an introvert. I knew what made me different. The trainer asked me a question. I did my normal, let me think about my answer. He went away, asked somebody else, never came back to me for my answer. And at the end of the session, gave me feedback that I lacked confidence and I needed to speak up more. Now, I don't lack confidence, but what it was is he didn't understand my communication process. So had I have communicated that better, or had he have been more aware, when he said, let me check in with somebody else, he'd have then come back to me and said, okay, Joe, now what's your response?
Mhm.
So one of the challenges is we don't get thinking time in conversations when we're in that fast-paced situation. When we do take thinking time, a judgment is often made that we don't know the answer, or we don't have anything to say, or we're holding back for some reason.
Mhm.
And this causes then many introverts to feel not okay about themselves, because the feedback where they constantly get is speak up, push yourself forward, be more this, be more that. In other words, be more extrovert, which sends us a really clear message that there is something wrong with being introverted.
Yeah.
Nothing wrong with it. We're just wired differently. We're not weird, just wired differently.
So it sounds like it might be like a self-fulfilling prophecy of, if someone is introverted, I think they lack confidence. And because I don't treat them with the same courtesy and consideration that I would another student, that causes them to lack confidence. Is that kind of the cycle?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, there's a couple of other nuances which it's worth knowing about, which is if the point has already been made, an introvert is highly unlikely to repeat something somebody else has said.
Mm.
And because they typically have listening as a really high skill, if they've already heard somebody say pretty much what they're going to say, they'll think there's no point kind of adding to that.
Mm.
So introverts tend not to use airtime unnecessarily. And so you're right, because we're the ones who speak up less in a meeting, the judgment is made that we lack confidence. And then we kind of think, well, there's no point now. There's no point saying anything. So we can get caught in a vicious circle of actually, well, if they don't think I have confidence, then guess what? I behave like I don't. And if we think about some of the, end of term reports or feedback, there's that constant push for an introvert to speak up, to do more, to be different. And for them, and we can do that. So don't get me wrong, I can behave any way I choose. I just need to make sure my mental battery is charged enough to be able to do that. And I need time afterwards to recharge.
Mm.
So I can behave in any way I choose. But actually, if I'm pushed to do it all the time and I'm not getting time to recharge, it's going to impact negatively on my mental health and well-being.
Yeah. Yeah. So, you know, as a teacher, or we talk about um coaches and instructors, all different types of people that are impacting the learning of their students.
Yeah.
What are some ways that we can identify, because I know there is a really big push for teachers to help students increase their confidence, and that's not a bad thing, but what are some ways we can understand, like, okay, this student is an introvert versus, okay, this student needs help with their confidence or their learning? How do we identify
Yeah.
the differences?
So it's a really good question. And I think it's about having a balance of activities. So as much as there are the kind of working out loud type processes in any class situation, let's also make sure we're balancing that with reflective exercises, because the introverts may have noticed more of what was being said in a conversation. They may not have contributed much to it, but they can give you a brilliant reflective account of it. So
Mm.
when we help introverts recognize that the strengths and talents that they have naturally are actually much in demand in business and society today. So if we were doing more listening at a better, higher quality level, imagine what a better place we'd be in, rather than just this competitive speaking at each other. And it's almost like two monologues missing each other rather than real dialogue. So
Mm.
when we help introverts realize that your strength is a genuine strength, now how can we help you play to that strength and articulate it positively, then their confidence will naturally start to rise. So rather than telling them what's wrong and what they need to do differently, let's do a bit of appreciative inquiry. Let's notice what it is they do well and what they enjoy doing, and let's help them do more of that, and that will increase their confidence.
Yeah, that's great. What so you're talking about the different balancing of different style activities. What are can you elaborate more on that? Because I think teachers might come from, like, if I'm an extroverted teacher, I might not be the type of person that is familiar with that type of thing, and that might feel almost wrong for me to to do. What are some what are some examples of those activities that help empower an introverted student?
So if we were thinking about, getting people thinking about a new concept, for
Mhm.
instance, a typical process that would make it genuinely inclusive for both introverts and extroverts would be, okay, first of all, what I want you to do is spend 5 minutes kind of thinking about what that concept means to you, and where you see it play out in society, perhaps. Then what I want you to do is chat it through with your buddy, see where there's some commonality, see where there's some differences. Then we're going to put you into two large groups. So the introvert has had a chance to think, they've had a chance to chat it through in a small group, then they're more likely then to know their own mind and be able to contribute in that larger group.
Mm,
And if I can share with you, I'm part of many introvert groups, and there are things that um, really make it difficult for introverts to learn. The first is this sense of forced fun. So a lot of teachers and facilitators even assume that, my version of fun is going to be your version of fun, and
sure.
yet fun is very subjective. So we need to understand that because I've built fun into this activity or fun into this lesson, it's not going to be fun for everyone. And I need to notice who's not having fun and think about variations of that. So what might a group who love kind of shooting the breeze and really chatting things through, and making, I don't know, a balloon animal or something, that might appeal to them. But what's the parallel reflective activity I can give to the group of quieter students who maybe need to do their reflection internally rather than out loud?
Mm,
So that sense of forced fun is a big no-no. And ironically, as is the what I referred to in my TED talk as the um, I've forgotten the phrase I use now. That's interesting, isn't it? But the creeping death of introductions,
okay.
because you know, let's all go around and introduce ourselves and say something surprising. Introverts aren't great at small talk; they're quite private, and actually, it's nobody else's business is what they might think or
Mm.
what they might say. So I think, again, teachers and facilitators need to get more creative about how we get people to introduce themselves, and not just stick with the ways that actually are going to have introverts retreat into their shell at the outset, because then you're going to struggle to kind of crack them open to contribute.
Yeah, it sounds like it could be really counterproductive at the end of the
Yeah.
day. That's everything. That's it's interesting because as you talk, I already know from my past experience that I tend to be more introverted. And one of the first realizations that I had that I might be built this way was kind of like the get to know you icebreaker activities on the first day of school. I hated that so
Yeah.
much.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what you're talking about, is putting the introverted students in a position where they're not able to flourish. They're not able to put themselves out there in a way that's appropriate for them, right?
Yeah, and it just feels like, yet again, the spotlight is on them being wrong or different.
Hmm.
So, far from it being diversity, equity, and inclusion, what we've actually got is sameness and exclusivity rather than inclusivity, by forcing everyone kind of down the same path. My niece is a teacher of 10-year-olds, and when she came to my TED talk, she went away and implemented in their classroom a quiet table,
Mm.
not for children who were naughty, but for children who needed space to think. And children at any stage during her class would opt to go and sit on the quiet table, where they weren't going to be interrupted by, little James next to them, kind of, bashing them on the hand or messing around or doing whatever. And it made such a difference to have it as a natural part of their learning process, rather than either as a punishment or something to go to the quiet table. And that made a massive difference.
Yeah, and you know what I like that you just said was, or kind of inferred, was the process of doing these things, such as the quiet table, is not to turn an introvert into an extrovert, right?
No.
I think that might be something that different teachers and instructors struggle with, because you want so badly to see them quote unquote come out of their shell and that type of thing. But these processes you're describing are not meant to do that. They're meant to empower them the way that they're already built, correct?
Absolutely. And if you get a bit like me, if you get an introvert on a subject they're passionate about, they will talk, they will engage, but what they won't do is kind of do that about things that don't really interest them. And that doesn't mean there's something wrong with them.
Mm-hmm.
It just means that actually they're preserving their battery for when there is something they really want to engage with and talk about. So we're not, many introverts don't have social anxiety, some do, but then, I know some extroverts with social anxiety. Can you imagine how challenging that is to need that social interaction in order to recharge the battery and to experience social anxiety? Now, that's what I call crippling.
Sure.
And yet often we see introversion conflated with depression and social anxiety and even misanthropy in some cases, the hatred of people. We don't hate people, they just drain us. So we need to do it in small doses and have time in between. So when I'm on a break, I'm going to sit quietly and read. I'm not going to tear around and go and chat with everyone. That doesn't mean that I'm unhappy. It doesn't mean I'm lonely. What it means is I'm quietly recharging my battery, ready for the next lesson.
Yeah, that's great. What we talked a lot about, teachers seeing these type of students and how to empower them, excuse me. Do you have any tips for, because most of our listeners work with younger students, we're not talking about teaching adults, we're talking about teaching kids. Do you have any advice for helping create a culture within a children's classroom? Because it's very easy for, for example, your TED talk, for an adult to listen to that and be like, oh, okay, excuse me, that's different. I understand that now. But for a kid who's 8, 9, 10 years old, they're not going to understand that this person recharges their batteries differently. That doesn't make any sense to them. So have you seen any strategies or any ways to help create that culture for our younger students?
So there's a couple of things that might be useful. One of them, I think it's about raising awareness at a young age, because if we tackle this early enough, the youngsters will cease to think there's something wrong with them. So I think it is about raising awareness that we don't all operate in the same way, that for some of us, we are genuinely wired differently. So functional neuroimaging studies show that the brains of introverts and extroverts light up differently when stimulated in the same way. So finding a way of helping the group understand that. And there was a little exercise we used when I was training as a Myers-Briggs practitioner, which is that we gave everyone 3 kind of blank, almost like matchsticks with no, spark on the end. And they had to discuss a topic. And every time they said something, they had to put a matchstick into the center of the table. And of course, what happens really quickly is that the extroverts, or the ones who just speak off the cuff or shoot from the hip, whatever, get rid of their matchsticks really quickly. And then you're left with the introverts who've hung on to their matchsticks, thought about what they want to say before they contribute. So there are some lovely little exercises like that that help people understand that, the way that this group here operate is different to the way this group here operate. And once you have an awareness of that, and most teachers will know who the quieter ones are, who probably get their head down and do really great work, but just don't interact as much. So when you're putting them into groups to work, put the quiet ones together rather than mixing the quiet and the loud ones, because otherwise the quiet ones will get drowned out by the loud ones, not get a chance to contribute. And we see that happen through into business as well, where we don't get a chance to say anything in meetings. So just be really intentional about how you split them into smaller groups or pairs even. And rather than thinking, oh, I'm going to put Joe with Matt because Joe's a bit quiet and Matt will bring her out of her shell a bit, actually put Joe with Jane, because they can both be quiet and they may sit in comfortable silence for a while thinking about what they're saying. And it doesn't mean they're not working. What it means is actually what they're doing is thinking about it before they get to the piece where they're going to talk about it.
Awesome. That's really cool. And it's interesting because so much of what you're just saying, I can see in my prior experience as a classroom teacher of just being counterintuitive.
Yeah,
It's not what you normally see. A lot of teachers find their default setting at, and so to hear that, you have to be very um, purposeful in your planning and taking that into account. Um,
yeah,
and one thing I just want to point out is, just like we're saying that there's nothing wrong with being introverted, we're also saying there's nothing wrong with being extroverted. It just tends to be that the bias leans in that direction, correct?
yes. So the stats tell us that about in the US, it's just over 50%. In the UK, it's just under 50% of people identify as an introvert.
Hmm.
And that surprises a lot of people, because we tend to think of, over here in the UK, we think of the US as a much more extroverted society.
Yep.
What that means is there's more people pretending over there, pretending, that they are more outgoing in order to fit in and get on. So I think it's important that we recognize, absolutely, and when we're doing that kind of awareness piece, there's nothing wrong with either. But in the same way that introverts need that quiet time to recharge their batteries, extroverts need that interaction and that spark to recharge theirs. So you're right, there's nothing wrong with either. But the more we understand the difference, and more than tolerate it, value that difference, the better, because that's when the introverts can really play to their strengths. So we tend to be such good listeners that we can pick up on what's not being said as well as what's being said. So, we'll really notice things like that. We tend to be a really calming influence, so we can take the heat out of a situation, even at quite a young age. And we tend to be really good with the written word, or that reflective piece, whereas the extroverts in terms of learning styles are going to be the ones who want to get stuck in and give things a go. We'd probably sit back and rather watch somebody else, not to copy, but to say, yeah, I like what they did there, I'm going to try that, or I didn't like that, I'm going to try something different.
Yeah.
So you're right, there is nothing wrong with either. What we need to really do is understand the difference and actually value that difference.
Yeah. And I just, as I listen to you talk, I almost equate it to like a sports team with both offense and defense. One is not better than the other. In fact, you need both. So
Yes,
uh, by creating a class that honors both and empowers both, you're going to have a stronger learning environment, I would imagine.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And if we get into that kind of giving positive feedback to, or the motivational feedback, so at the end of the day, as an introvert, what is it I value about my extroverted buddy in the class? So I value, or I really appreciate your ability to come to an answer quickly and share that with us, and then get the extrovert to share something they value about the introvert. So the more we get people to, and even as youngsters, the more we get, people to really talk about what they value about the difference, the more it really becomes something that they value.
Yeah, that's great. I really appreciate that a lot. That's awesome. Um, Great. Well, Joanna, we're starting to wrap up here. I think we had a really great conversation. If someone wants to learn more about your organization and the work that you do, or just hear more on the topic, where can they find you? Quick outs, quick shout out, social media, that type of thing. Where are you at?
You can get pretty much everything from my website, which is flourishingintroverts.com. And there you'll find my podcast, which is a weekly thing. You'll find my TEDx talk. You'll find a link to a questionnaire that says, what type of introvert are you? Because there are 6 pure types and a multitude of blends. So it's worth knowing what type you are so that you can play to your strengths. Occasional musings there and occasional downloads. So I have a great download of how to raise introverted children, which people might find useful too.
Mm. Yeah, and I would encourage, if for our teachers that are like, well, I'm extroverted, that doesn't apply to me, to definitely check that out, because you're going to encounter all sorts of people. Like you said, 50% is
Yeah.
about where the number hovers. And social media, are you on Facebook? Where can we check you out there?
Yes, so I've got a Facebook page, which is Flourishing Introverts. I've also got a group for introverts and those who care about us. And the podcast, I should say, is also for introverts and those who want to understand introversion better. So that's the Flourishing Introvert talks, dispelling the myth that we don't have anything to say for ourselves.
Awesome. Great. Well, we will definitely link all those things down in the description below. Joanna, thank you so much for being here today. It was a really great talk. I really hope it informs a lot of our instructors out there who are listening about the different types of students they have in the classroom. Really appreciate you being here.
Thanks. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Yeah, no problem. And thank you to all our listeners who are tuning in. Don't forget to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and check out our YouTube channel. If you're looking for more How to Teach Anything content, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram for the latest updates and information about upcoming episodes. My name is Matt Eiler. You've been listening to the How to Teach Anything podcast. Thanks for tuning in, and we will talk to you next time. Take care.